are a UK-based religion and society think tank. We're interested in what religion in general and Christianity in particular can offer to enrich our public life and our public conversations. And we do this by undertaking research, commenting in the media. We run the Sacred podcast, and we also host events like this one. So this week, we're delighted to be launching Hannah's latest report called Beyond Left and Right, Finding Consensus on Economic Inequality. And the report is available to download free from our website, but you can also order yourself a beautiful little hard copy for an absolute bargain of only £5, just in time to fill your Christmas stocking. So get in there with that one. Now, this is Theos's second report on economic inequality. Last year, we published a report called Bridging the Gap, which set out the scale of economic inequality in the UK, some of the economic and philosophical arguments about it, and also how churches in the UK are or are not responding to it. As we know, the pandemic has brought into sharp focus the gap between rich and poor and the middling. And so we wanted to return to this topic of economic inequality, and this time focusing in particular on what Christian theology has to say and how it might give us ideas that could help us to move beyond what is often quite a polarized and fraught debate about this topic. In a second, we'll be hearing from Hannah about the process of writing this report and her findings. But first, a bit of housekeeping, as always. Hannah's going to be talking through the report for about 20 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes or so of discussion, myself and her. And then there'll be about 25 minutes or so for questions from you. We'll be disabling the chat function while Hannah is speaking. We found from previous events that sometimes the chat function can get quite busy, so we'll turn that off. But to ask your questions, put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and then I'll read them out and give them to Hannah. We're going to be finishing at 1:30 p.m. sharp, so apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, although we'll do our best to. We're also live streaming this event on YouTube, but we're only going to be able to take questions from Zoom. The talk is going to be recorded and it will be available and uploaded onto YouTube in the next 24 hours. And so with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Hannah Rich. Hannah is a senior researcher at Theos, and she's been with us since 2017. She's the author of our major report, Growing Good, published last year, which explores the connections between social action, discipleship, and church growth in the Church of England. She holds an MSc in Inequalities and Social Science from the LSE, and before joining Theos, she worked for a social innovation think tank and a learning disability charity. Hannah, thank you very much for joining, and over to you.
Thanks, Simon. And what Simon very modestly isn't saying is that he was the author of Bridging the Gap, which was our first inequality report, which was a fantastic report and a really good basis to build on this work. So thank you in more than one ways there, Simon. Great. So if we go to the slides, hopefully. There we go. So on the first slide, the next one, you'll see a series of press headlines about inequality. There we go. And these are from a very quick search that I did a few months ago of just stories from the last 6 months. It's literally a handful of the first stories that I found without digging deeper into other forms of inequality, than the economics. So I didn't look into gender or race or other of those things. And a search for levelling up would have produced far more, as you can imagine. And I noticed that several of these publications as well have an inequality subheading or a section on their website. So the Financial Times and the Guardian both do that. The more eagle-eyed among you may well notice that the bottom one, the one from the Telegraph, is in fact from the sports section. It's talking about financial inequality in international test cricket rather than in education or whatever. But I actually think that's a really good example of how widespread the inequality paradigm, as we might call it, now is. That language of an inequality gap, which used to belong to a fairly niche group of economists and social scientists, is now fairly commonplace in discussions of inequality, even in sport. The next slide shows a slightly different way of looking at it. This is the mentions of the word inequality in Hansard archives since 1800, so the frequency with which the word has been used in parliamentary debates in the UK. You can see a relative peak, I think, when the Income Tax Act was introduced in 1842. But the really significant increase in mentions is very obvious over the last couple of decades, which reflects that wider increase in interest and discussion of the topic in the same time period. There's a pretty much tenfold increase since 1970. So our politicians talk about inequality literally 10 times as frequently as they did 50 years or 2 generations ago. It is worth acknowledging that this graph isn't by any means a proxy for economic inequality itself, which has fluctuated massively over that time. But it does demonstrate, I think, that in recent years, at least, the lack of effective action to address inequality isn't for a lack of talking about it. Does that matter, we might ask? Well, it seems that public attitudes are shifting towards seeing inequality as a greater problem. On the next slide is a graph from some polling we recently commissioned, and we'll be publishing this in full in the next few weeks, but that found that 76% of people disagreed with the statement that the UK is an economically equal country. 42% roughly strongly disagreed, and 34% tended to disagree. And when we broke the data down by demographic, we found that in every single demographic group, whether by age, gender, income, class, or ethnicity, a significant majority disagreed with the statement, which is a pretty universal thing. And I'll explore some of the implications of that perhaps later on. But if we consider inequality to be a social problem as well as an economic one, then the fact that such a large proportion of people perceive the country as unequal should be pretty instructive for how seriously we take it. Excessive inequality, as we'll go on to see, is it a feeling as much as it is a measurable economic reality or a state of affairs. So if we're looking for an issue around which to build consensus, it would seem that economic inequality is a pretty powerful one to work with. 76% of the population kind of thinking that it's something that matters is far bigger than any parliamentary majority we've seen recently. But it's this exact idea, particularly with its geographic and economic forms, that the government have tried to tap into with the levelling up agenda and the rhetoric of that. Levelling up got 11 mentions in the Chancellor's budget speech a few weeks ago. The word inequality got none. And that's not to say he wasn't talking about inequality, but was talking about levelling up, which is a way of talking about it. Just this week, Lisa Nandy's been appointed the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up, reflecting kind of in line with the renaming of the government department of that. As an aside, I did the same Hansard search for levelling up. And the first mention of the phrase as a phrase in Hansard was actually in an 1868 debate about financial inequality between church denominations in Ireland. So there was some precedent, I guess, for the church or for theologians getting involved in this as a conversation. But even where there is consensus, it might seem that inequality is an issue. Potential solutions draw more partisan-based support. And it's therefore quite a lot harder to build a coalition of agreement around how and even whether we should tackle it. In fact, research published just today by the UK in a Changing Europe and Ipsos Mori found that MPs are more polarised than their voters on the question of how much the government should intervene to ensure greater equality of income. So while Labour and Conservative voters don't entirely agree, on how far the government should go, the gap between Labour and Conservative MPs is much, much greater. However, consensus is precisely what we were aiming for in producing this report. We brought together a group of policy professionals, charity workers, theologians, and economists, some of whom I think are here today, and all of whom we're incredibly grateful to for their wisdom and their time in that process. For a series of 3 online roundtables in summer of 2021, we asked questions about why inequality matters and what, if anything, we should do about it, as well as probing how theology might provide a new way of thinking about the topic. If it hadn't been for COVID, I think we might have considered kind of locking them all in a room physically until they found something they could agree on. But we did the next best thing, and we spent several afternoons together in Zoom breakout rooms threshing these issues out. And through that, we arrived at a number of principles, and these cut across the reasons why economic inequality does matter, when it becomes excessive, and what the role of theology could be in speaking to policy here. And these are not what I'll go on to mention, these are not an exhaustive list of the topics covered. It's not everything that was discussed in the roundtables, but they're the ones around which we found people from different perspectives, and there were many different perspectives represented in those roundtables. These are the ones that people were best able to coalesce across difference. And the same is true of the policy proposals that I'll go on to mention later on, and the ones that are outlined in the report. They're by no means the only policies that might resolve inequality. They're not necessarily the ones that would have the biggest impact per se, but they're the ones that garner, or that we found garnered, the largest coalition of support. So consensus is kind of what we're focusing on here, not necessarily just impact. So firstly, I think this is on the next slide, inequality is not only an economic problem, but a social and relational one too. We found agreement that inequality is especially concerning when it undermines our capacity to have good relationships with one another and separates us from community. In other words, inequality is considered excessive, not at a particular coefficient or measurement, or when the Gini coefficient reaches a certain level, for example, but when it begins to impact on how we relate to one another. Returning to what I said earlier, if 76% of the population think the country is unequal, then that inevitably affects how we see ourselves and how we see each other, regardless of the measured level of inequality. And in some ways, this is, I guess, inherent in the difference in how we talk about inequality and poverty, although they are connected. You won't need me to tell you that. If you're not classed as poor, then it's possible to ignore poverty or to not be too concerned by it. But inequality by our nature is about our relationship with each other. While if you're not poor, then you can leave that to one side. One person can't be affected by inequality without everybody else also being, because inequality is by necessity or by definition about how we are connected to each other. Next, the next point that we kind of found agreement on was that excessive inequality is both the cause and a symptom of societal dysfunction. So it reflects kind of a deeper power imbalance often between those with and without resources. And then lastly, there are profound ecological, environmental, as well as economic reasons to be concerned about inequality. This felt particularly pressing as we were holding the discussions in the run-up to COP26, and we're obviously kind of after that now, still very much thinking about these issues. But in measurement terms, inequality is driven by the excesses of the super rich, as well as by the lack experienced by those without resources. It matters at both ends. But if we seek to reduce inequality through development, through lifting people out of poverty, without also tackling the excesses of the super rich or the very wealthy, well, that has grave consequences for our use of planetary resources, for how much of planet's resources we are using or demanding. And they're definitely not inexhaustible. So there are environmental implications for this. So moving on to theology and what theology might say here. Firstly, theology underlines the importance of human relationships and how they are affected by inequality. It tells us that as humans, we are fundamentally dependent on a network of relationships to flourish. We're dependent on each other and to flourish and to make meaning. And so inequality is harmful where it prevents this flourishing. Secondly, looking at things through the lens of theology provides a moral imagination that allows us to acknowledge that the world is not the way it should be, not the way it was ever intended to be. And this in turn can offer a catalyst for addressing injustice where it exists. You have to acknowledge a problem in order to address it. And while the language of sin, for example, isn't very often used in policymaking or in the secular world, and it's definitely not a word that we take particularly lightly, it is also a framework for recognizing where we both individually and collectively have gone wrong and have contributed to some of the injustices that we see, particularly in the economy. Thirdly, the practical engagement of faith communities with the symptoms of inequality through their social action and through their presence in local communities gives them a real legitimacy in speaking to this debate and about the harms that inequality causes. And then lastly, there are, we explored some of these in the roundtables, and people brought a wealth of different examples. But there are specific theological principles from throughout history, throughout the entirety of theological tradition, that we argue have a huge amount to contribute to our contemporary economic understanding. In the report, we explore a number of these, drawing on what is legislated, what is condemned, and what is modelled throughout the Bible. principles like Jubilee and the Sabbath that enshrine the fair distribution of resources in Old Testament Israel, but that are also very relevant to contemporary economics as well. And in texts from St. Ambrose and John Chrysostom right through to Pope Francis, we find examples of theological principles that speak to inequality. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper for it. Inequality as a word, for example, is relatively recent in its usage. You don't find the word necessarily in much of the Old Testament, but there is certainly a huge amount of kind of, if you dig beyond where they're talking about justice and injustice, and actually what is being talked about is the inequality between the rich and the poor. And one kind of, I guess, example that is mentioned in the report, and there are plenty of others, but one to highlight in particular is Rerum Novarum, which is an encyclical from Pope Leo XIII, which is a great example. The title means of revolutionary change, but it cuts a really clear path between left and right economics. It eschews both capitalism and communism, straight kind of brings examples from both of those, but in some ways tries to find consensus between them, as we were trying to do. It's an entire encyclical about labour and capital, but which is equally scathing about socialism as it is about right-wing ideology. Pope Leo recognises that rising support for socialist ideologies at the time he was writing was driven by the unequal distribution of resources within the market. Again, he doesn't mention the word inequality at all, but he's constantly talking about the unequal distribution of resources. But he sees socialism as the wrong solution to a genuine problem. In the same breath as kind of enshrining the right to hold private property, he warns against unrestricted capitalism and speaks to the necessity of the universal access to the basic essentials of a good life. So from prophets to papal encyclicals, we kind of think it's pretty clear that theology has something to say to this debate. And so finally, what does any of this mean for policy? What does any of this look like in terms of actually applicable solutions or policy initiatives? We outline in the report various policy solutions and means of addressing economic inequality that we suggest are, as I said before, the ones most likely to achieve consensus across tribes, across political tribes. Coming back to that, so this is on the next slide, sorry. Coming back to that important principle that inequality is a relational problem, then relational solutions are inevitably important. We begin from that position that people are not just economic equations to be fixed or inequalities to be leveled up, but potential to be developed. And there is a role for both business and the state in this. So firstly, we propose that improving cohesion between people of different backgrounds is key to addressing the social consequences of inequality, whether that's through community projects, educational programs like a national citizen scheme, shared public spaces, and better infrastructure can also engender more equal relationships within communities. And a practical example of that would be the idea of poor doors that are often built in tower blocks, the idea that social housing tenants have different entrances to those buildings than those that own their homes. We see eradicating those, getting rid of those, and they are being phased out. But that's a way of designing inequality into a community, but it's also a way that inequality can kind of be physically designed out. Next, policy initiatives that support stable households may also reduce economic inequality too, not least because of the improved health and educational outcomes associated with that. And while the size and the role of the state in mediating economic inequality is disputed, and that's, we could have a whole big conversation about that, we argue that greater investment in support services and adult education, for example, would address some of the causes of inequality as well as remedying some of the symptoms. The model of universal basic services, for example, could shape that. And then from a kind of state and economic policy perspective, taxation is also important. It's quite contentious, but actually we found that it can reinforce the social dynamic of the economy, highlighting that theological principle that wealth is temporary, that it should be held lightly, and that we do have some sort of duty to each other in the redistribution thereof. And we identified as well, and I think this is something that's been talked about quite a lot recently, but there's a greater openness to previously contentious or disputed forms of tax, such as a wealth tax, in light of the pandemic. Data out last month, I think, from Tax Justice UK found that 80% of the public support tougher action against tax avoidance in the wake of the Pandora Papers revelations. And voters of all groups are more likely to think that individual and corporate tax avoidance is wrong, more likely now than they were a year ago, suggesting there's a groundswell of support for action there as well, not just in terms of, we're not just saying that action on tax needs to be increasing tax, but actually kind of addressing tax avoidance, making sure that the redistribution that is already in the law does take place, is very, very important and actually more likely to achieve consensus than you might think. And then from the perspective of the market, we suggest that pay ratios between employees could achieve greater inequality within and between organizations, along with reorienting our economy towards more cooperative models and worker-led democracy. And this makes economic sense as well as social sense. Cooperatives UK found that the co-op model proved more resilient during the pandemic. Cooperative businesses were 4 times less likely to go under during 2020. And the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy is a great example of this as well. It has the lowest socioeconomic inequality of any region in Europe. And cooperative businesses represent just under 40% of its GDP, which is very high. And those facts are not entirely unrelated to each other. And together with specific policy proposals, there is, I think, also scope for reimagining our entire economic models. We suggest that a Christian approach to inequality would mean recalibrating the economy to prioritise well-being without disregarding economic growth altogether. And we suggest that beginning from the human and the relational dynamics of inequality in policymaking, as we've highlighted that those are really important, beginning from those is a route to much greater consensus than focusing on economic dynamics. It's often in the minutiae of economic policy that polarization kind of comes out, but actually talking about the human and relational dynamics of inequality is a clear route to greater consensus across parties and across perspectives. So I'm going to finish with this picture on the next slide. You may have seen this before. It's quite a famous representation of inequality, quite literally. It's a photo from a Brazilian photographer called Tuca Vieira in 2004, I think, in Sao Paulo. And on the left, you have a favela or a slum, kind of ironically called Paraísopolis, which means Paradise City, bordered on the right by Morumbi, which is one of the wealthiest districts in Sao Paulo. And in the middle, you've literally got the administrative boundary between the two communities, but a more symbolic boundary between the super rich and the super poor. The next slide is the same scene in 2020. And you can see some material improvements, I think, on the left-hand side, but little suggestion that the excess and the wealth on the wealthier side has been curbed in any way. And that illustrates, I think, the ecological point that I made earlier, that the need to address inequality matters on both sides, not just by developing and improving the life circumstances of the poorest without concern for what that means for the planet. Obviously, the fractures caused by inequality aren't always as glaring as this picture shows, but it's a good representation of the human nature of it. You can look at this picture and perhaps imagine what it would feel like to live in a community this obviously segregated along economic lines. You can think about what effect that would have on relationships, what human dynamic that would have. But as we've hopefully demonstrated in this report, this is no less true within our own society. The minute inequality affects how we live and how we relate to each other and what it means to live well together, then it becomes a problem. And that's something it's much easier, I think, to agree on than the economic level at which too much is too much. And with that, I think I'll hand back over to Simon for a question and answer. So do start putting your questions in the Q&A. And I'm sure Simon's got some tricky ones to start us off.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll try and hopefully not too tricky. Thank you very much indeed for that excellent overview of this brilliant report that you've written. As Hannah said, we'll be moving to a period of Q&A now, so do type any questions you've got into that Q&A chat box, and I will turn to them shortly. But just some starter questions, Hannah, just to sort of draw out a bit more. You've a core part of this research is obviously about the Christian theology and what that might say about economic inequality. And no doubt some of the vision that you've been setting out will have a lot of resonance with many Christians in our audience today. But of course, your report is trying to speak beyond that and speaking to policymakers and business people of all faiths and none. So a two-part question then. In your view, why should people who are not Christian pay attention to what Christian theology has got to say about economic inequality, and then link to this, what are the key kinds of things you think are missing from the secular debate about inequality that you think Christian theology can fill?
Great, thanks, Simon. Well, in terms of why theology and why we should be bothered about thinking about what theology has to say, we arrived at this as a topic for a report, or as something that we thought was worth looking at, because as I sort of outlined to begin with, it's something that's been talked about a lot. Inequality is not something that there is any shortage of reports on or kind of policy discussions on. And it was fairly clear that despite that wealth of discussion on it, agreement is pretty hard to come by. And so there needs to be a new perspective, something new in the conversation, something that's not already, a perspective that's not already being factored into that. And theology as a discipline, not just as a kind of the content of it, involves thinking quite differently from economics. If you studied theology or you studied economics, the way you study those and the way you're using ideas and your brain when you're doing that is quite different. Even before you get into the specifics of what specific theology can say or specific doctrines can offer to this. Theology is about grappling deeply with questions of human identity, relationships, thinking about what we owe to each other. And it's been seeking these answers to questions like these and other questions for thousands of years. And so we think that there is something in there that is worth considering. It's historical as well as it is religious. And principles like, for example, the Jubilee is a historical principle that was around in Old Testament Israel. And even if you don't kind of share and subscribe to the faith content of that, the tradition from which it comes, there is something about learning from the whole of history that is worth bringing to bear on this conversation. And I think that's something particularly that theology offers that we were hopeful of kind of exploring here. Duncan Forrester, who's a theologian, calls it the human meaning of inequality. And the human meaning of inequality is something that is perhaps easier to arrive at or easier to understand through a theological lens than it is through an economic one. But even if it's not easier, it certainly looks slightly different if you look at that through theology. So I think that's hopefully why theology is relevant, whether or not you share the faith that it belongs to.
And I suppose some of these ideas that you're talking about are translatable into secular terms as well. And I think in your report you're emphasizing the importance of solidarity as well, and that seems to me to be an important theme that is easily translatable into secular terms, although it has a particular meaning within Christianity. But I suppose it's those kinds of translatable ideas that you're kind of wanting to draw upon here and pass into wider society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just recently in the US, there's a conversation about student debt and whether that should be written off or forgiven. And a lot of the commentators on that are talking about Joe Biden's debt jubilee. And that they're not talking about that in a religious sense. But I think it's quite significant that something that is a Judeo-Christian principle, something from the Old Testament, has relevance to contemporary economics, whether or not you do come at that from belonging to that faith tradition.
Great, thank you. And just another question then. You've talked about some of the range of different solutions to economic inequality, and some of those will obviously be more controversial than others, depending on where you sit politically. But which measures do you think are the ones that have the most potential to secure consensus across left and right?
So I think there are 2 points that I kind of would make here. The first would be an investment in early years and in education. You can argue that from both sides, and it's pretty electorally popular. For example, the Sure Start centres that were established by a Labour government a couple of decades ago were an attempt to do that, to invest in early years and to equalise the opportunities that are available to young families. They were a casualty of some of the funding cuts and austerity, but actually the recent budget included funding for family hubs, which are operating along a fairly similar model, actually, and returning to some of those things that were there. It's a universal service, but with a disproportionate benefit for the poorest 20% of households. And I think that, you as I say, you can argue, and it has been argued from both sides, that there are there's a really strong case that investing in early years is good for the country and particularly for inequality. And then secondly, I think, as I mentioned briefly before, there is increasingly a cross-partisan case for a wealth tax, perhaps particularly on the wealth that has been gained during the pandemic. And I think some of the arguments that have previously been levelled against a wealth tax, the idea that you shouldn't tax people's wealth because they've earned it, because it's something that they've hard won, it's not fair to put a tax on that. Some of those arguments are valid, but actually are less valid in light of the pandemic, because those who have gained wealth or increased their wealth during the pandemic, some have done that through hard work, but there are plenty of people who have worked incredibly hard throughout the pandemic and not seen those gains. So the way that the pandemic has changed our economy, I think, makes people more likely to support a wealth tax. And I think that's kind of shifted some of our attitudes towards the benefit system and towards welfare in general. Certainly furlough has been a very successful and very popular policy initiative in the UK. And that's increased the number of people who've accessed welfare, often people who never would have had recourse to that ever before. And so I think kind of socially that's shifting some attitudes on that. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see kind of a wealth tax coming through in the next few years. And I think that would be a cross-partisan case for that, not just a kind of specifically party political one.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah. We've got some questions coming in, which is brilliant. Firstly, a couple of questions on the market. Firstly, could you explain in a bit more detail the market solutions that you were mentioning? So you talked about pay ratios and cooperatives, and then a more fundamental question than that, or a point, is about is the market itself in some ways not fundamentally at odds with Christianity, if Christianity is about advocating cooperation for the common good over competition? So is it, is there a way that we can draw upon theology to reframe how we think about the market in general? So those two, firstly, explaining the practicalities, and then the more fundamental question.
Yeah, great. So the first one, pay ratios, to explain those, that is the ratio between the lowest paid and highest paid in a particular organization. And they're calculated, and in a lot of the FTSE 100 companies, and they're massive ratios in some of the bigger businesses that, the CEO earns kind of 100,000 times the salary of the lowest paid employee. And bringing in a pay ratio, or kind of trying to regulate those, says that the highest paid employee can only earn X times that of the lowest, and you can talk about what that would be. It literally reduces inequality, because it means that the gap between the highest and lowest paid has to be smaller than it currently is, has to be a certain level. But in relational terms, I think it's important as well, because it emphasizes the way that we are all connected to each other. So it's not thinking about just what a minimum wage is in isolation from the maximum wage, and that has obviously environmental consequences as well. But it also means that the CEO or the highest paid can give themselves a pay rise by all means. But in order to do that, they have to consider their relationship to people lower down the income tree. And so it's inherently a relational thing, because the nature of a ratio and the way it's calculated means you can't consider anyone's salary or anyone's income without considering someone else's. So that's something that the market could do. The market could say, or that we could have principles, and there are principles within particular companies that have committed to certain ratios. Those companies often do tend to be cooperative ones, for reasons that kind of that solidarity that Simon talked about before is there in the cooperative model, that everyone having a sense of ownership of the company and solidarity within it often plays out in different pay ratios. And in terms of whether it's worth completely reconsidering the way we think about the market, the way we talk about that, I think that's what we were kind of hinting at towards the end, with the fact that what we want to see is not, or what we'd recommend is not just policy solutions that address inequality. Some of those might seem a little bit like kind of tinkering around the edges, when actually what is needed is a complete rethinking of our economic models. But at the same time, we were very mindful in this that this isn't just a kind of, or this report isn't intended just as a Christian consideration of the market. It is a very consensus-based report. And so to kind of start from the principle of doing away with market ideologies or market economics altogether, you very quickly kind of get away from that consensus thing. So while there are plenty of other solutions that are not considered here, and while rethinking some of those models is critical. I said before about kind of prioritizing well-being within many of our economic conversations, but without getting rid of the idea of growth altogether. That's partly because it's easier to bring people with you on that conversation, and very pragmatically, you kind of do need to, and that's why we saw consensus as such an important part of this conversation, not just outlining everything that could be done. So
and part of that bringing people along is presumably in also how different solutions are framed. And you talk about this in the start of your report about the that certain policies or solutions might get greater support from the public depending on how they are framed. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's referencing some work from King's College London, actually, which was not my work, but it's referenced in the report. But they found that if you talk about, I think that what they found was that if you ask people, should the country be more equal, people are far more likely to say yes, than if you say, should there be a large amount of redistribution? Redistribution, not just because it's a more technical term, but it feels like a kind of more scary, more costly thing to ask people. But actually, we found as well that people don't think the country is equal. And so inherently, if you frame it in terms of the human consequences, that does the country feel equal? Do you think the country should be more equal? You're much more likely to get a majority of the population agreeing with you than if you say, should the government be responsible for redistribution wealth from the rich to the poor, or should the government even do that, or should we have any sense of redistribution? So the specifics of that I kind of outlined a little bit more in my introduction, and you can see the reference to the report that's based on there as well. But it is really important how we talk about these things in terms of getting consensus.
Great. A couple of questions here on more of the implications and consequences of economic inequality. What do we know about how economic inequality might affect things like resentment amongst the wider public and impact on crime, and also another question on how it might affect government as well, and good government, and does it pose a barrier to good government?
These are great questions because they relate very specifically actually to my master's dissertation, which was kind of what got me started on this whole field of study in the first place. My master's dissertation a couple of years ago looked at how economic inequality affects trust. Trust in the population, trust in institutions, and trust in the government. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I found that the greater countries with greater economic inequality, trust is lower. So people are less likely to trust their government if there's more inequality. People are less likely to trust fellow citizens, and that obviously has crime implications. It has relational implications as well. And that was a study that looked at 18 different European countries, from Scandinavia right through to Eastern Europe, including the UK. And so in terms of to what extent it's a barrier to good government, it's a barrier to democracy in the sense that it stops people trusting the government. And that wasn't connected to the flavour of the government, as you like. People are just less likely to trust institutions and governments, whether they're left-wing, right-wing governments, and whether they are beneficiaries of inequality, you might say, so whether they're kind of towards the top of that or a bottom. Universally, people less likely to trust their fellow citizens and their governments. And I think the implications of that are fairly obvious, that actually if right across the board people trust each other less, that's not a society or a community you particularly want to live in. And the implications of people not trusting the whole political system, and whatever it specifically looks like, are obviously quite concerning as well.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about thinking about the potential of a wealth tax again, and asking, is the urgency for this, is this likely to evaporate the further along we get from the pandemic? Hopefully not too far away. And if the urgency for that is likely to disappear the further we get from the pandemic, how might we, ordinary citizens, press for that kind of thing with greater urgency?
I think it probably will. evaporate over the next few years, although kind of when the point at which the pandemic ends is kind of hard to see at the moment. Obviously, the further, in the next few years, will the effects of the pandemic still be with us in the next few years? Probably. So maybe I would say probably in the next decade, perhaps we'll see that increase. So maybe there's kind of a 5-year window, not to put a specific number on it, but not a 2-year window for kind of 5 years in which this sense of it still will still be there. Although I think in general it will be interesting to see how long some of the changes that have happened to our economy and to the way we live from the pandemic. It's too early days really still to say how long they'll be with us and whether some of those will be permanent. I think it is important that if this is to be brought in and if the wealth tax does happen, that it happens framed in the context of the pandemic, so that people know that it is those wealth increases that happened as a result of pandemic. Certainly that's where the consensus is. And there are other ways of formulating a wealth tax that could just be at a certain date it happens, or it happens every Jubilee happens every 7 years, that sort of thing. But I think the most popular way to do it and the most likely way to actually achieve it is in the context of the pandemic. And so in terms of how we might press for that, the obvious way is kind of talking to politicians about it, but also organisations like the Jubilee campaign, like Tax Justice UK, are making noises around this. And so getting in touch with organisations like that. And if anyone wants further details, you can email me later, and I'm happy to put you in touch with the right people for those sort of things. But having these conversations, not just in context like this, but having these conversations more broadly, I think is really important.
Great. There's a point here about the Church's involvement and the Church of England specifically, and noting that the Church of England recently passed a motion on addressing wealth inequality, and asking further on from that, what should the Church's role be in this? What can the Church do?
Well, firstly, I think that motion was really good, and I would welcome that, in the sense that it wasn't just about, or as I understand that it wasn't just about wealth inequality generally. It was about acknowledging the Church of England's role in that, and the fact that there are huge inequalities between the wealth of different dioceses and different parts of the country within the Church of England, and that actually getting their own house in order in that sense is really important. Every time the Church talks about inequality in the country, the comeback can be, well, there's huge inequalities between the richest and poorest dioceses, need to sort that out first. So I think in terms of what that motion sought to do in that, it's really important. And in terms of the Church's role, if people want to know more about the Church's role in this, firstly, they should read your report, Simon. Your first report, Bridging the Gap, went into the specifics of what churches and faith groups can do, and went into those specifics a lot more than this report does. But I think having these conversations, continuing these conversations, whether that's in synod, whether that's in local church meetings, whether that's in context like this with other people, is really important, so that these conversations are kind of kept going, and thinking about the internal implications of those, the way that synod motion did. I think that's a brilliant model for faith groups to look at that. What does inequality mean for us? What does it look like within our own organisation, in order to then challenge it without the organisation?
Right. Another question, thinking about the policy solutions again, and trying to get to why do people sort of feel a particular way about about redistribution or inheritance tax? And a point here that even people who may well never have to pay an inheritance tax, or may not have to pay a lot in inheritance tax, may well feel opposed to it. And is that a reflection of their individual aspiration? They, ultimately aspire to be in a position where they would be able to pay, where they would have to pay in inheritance tax, so they preemptively feel opposed to it? Or are there other reasons why people oppose these kinds of solutions?
I think part of that is due to kind of how we understand ourselves in the economy and in relation to others. I don't know whether those, 1 in 4 who say they don't like it are aware that only 1 in 20 will ever need to pay it. Some of that is a framing issue. Some of that is just a matter of how we understand ourselves in the economy. And I think there are really kind of contradictory ways that we see that, our understanding of the average, our understanding of where we fit in inequality, where we fit in the economy. There was that example a couple of years ago, I think just before the last election, of a man who was on Newsnight getting particularly angry because someone had said he was in the top 5% and he ought to be taxed, and he earned, I think, £100,000, and he couldn't fathom that this put him in the top 5% in the country, where it very patently did. But at the same time, 1 in 4 people, 1 in 5 who don't like the inheritance tax, many of those have the perception that they are wealthy enough that they will have to pay it, and haven't quite connected that when we talk about the super rich, that really is a kind of elite group of people who will have to pay it, and who certainly will have to pay it to the extent that is being talked about. So I think it's something that I talk about quite a lot, but better education in terms of our understanding of where we are in relation to others, thinking about it relationally, thinking about who we are and where we are, actually might shift how people think about redistributive policies, because some people are more likely to benefit those than they realise. Some people, by contrast, are more likely to have to pay those things than they realise, but actually that's perhaps a good thing that they understand that, and then are more likely to see the benefit of it if they realise quite how wealthy they are in comparison to others. So I think the answer to that is framing, and is talking about this. And actually, some of the polling that we've done and that we're publishing soon looks at how wealthy people think they are compared to others. So there'll be some more discussion of that when that's published in a week or so's time. But that's certainly a question that's very, very live in relation to this.
Great, thank you. There's a suggestion here that that the teaching of the New Testament seems to lean very, very much towards socialist ideas and views, particularly in the context of inequality. And if that's the case, why doesn't the church just say that? What's your views on that?
My first view on that would be, I think it's quite dangerous to kind of ascribe modern kind of ideologies and values to something from that long ago. There is certainly some teaching in that you might think aligns with particular political positions from today, but the entirety of it doesn't. The entirety of it doesn't fit with any kind of particular ideology from today, bar that of Christianity. And so I think kind of labeling things in kind of sort of anachronous ways, I guess, doesn't necessarily help us. And in terms of why the church doesn't clearly say that, certainly that wouldn't be particularly popular in terms of achieving consensus. It would alienate large groups of people who believe in Christianity, who kind of believe in the value of the teaching of the New Testament, but don't have those specific politics. And so I think being clearly aligned to one thing or another isn't necessarily the role of the church when we're talking about particular political ideologies. Certainly the church should be clearly speaking against inequality where it is an injustice. But I don't think necessarily that the only way to do that is to say the church is a socialist institution and therefore is against inequality. There are much more constructive ways of doing that allows the church to speak validly into those conversations and effect change there, but without having to kind of ascribe a particular ideology to a particular chapter of the New Testament.
There's a question here about the environmental reasons for addressing inequality, and just a question about how much impact can reducing the consumption of the super rich actually have on our environmental crisis, and is it that the super rich are burning a huge amount of far more carbon than the rest of us, or is it in the magnitude of only 10 times more? Would curbing the consumption of the super rich for environmental reasons actually make that much of a difference?
On this one, if we're talking particularly about flights as something that burns a particular amount of carbon, I think it's important to think about who the rest of us are in this conversation. So the vast majority of the population in the world have never been on a flight, don't fly regularly. and so comparatively, even then to someone who flies twice, 3 times a year, it's not in the magnitude of 1 million, but it is significantly more. And then when you have people who are flying very regularly, weekly, or whatever that is, then that is quite clearly, there's a quite clear imbalance between the vast majority of the population, even if those of us in this conversation who kind of go on holiday once a year before the pandemic, fly maybe once or twice a year, are actually in the minority globally anyway. And so kind of thinking about the super rich who burn a huge amount of carbon, but actually that in that sense, it is a broader category of people. So we're talking about a very small number of people globally, comparatively, but in terms of the proportion of global carbon that they do use and consumption that they do use, it's disproportionate. So yeah, I think that kind of gets to that.
And could you say on this point a bit more about the notion of enough and enoughness that you refer to in the report? Yeah,
so this I think is a very theological principle, the idea of having enough and there being a concept of enough, and that actually if all of us in the world live within that concept of enough, not having too much, not a huge group of people who have too much in inverted commas and a group of people who have nowhere near enough, but actually if we're all living within the boundary of kind of sufficient resources for a good life, and we can talk about what that might include, but that sense of not stretching the planet's boundaries beyond what it can do, but without actually impacting our capacity to live a good life, and to have a flourishing life in relationship with each other, and that sense of it. So the model that I refer to through the report, many of you will be familiar with it, of the donut economics model that Kate Rayworth uses, that idea that there is a donut within which we can all live. And at the moment, there are people beyond the outer ring of the donut, and a large proportion of people within the center of the donut who don't have enough. But actually, if we're all living above the minimum floor of what it is to live well, and below the kind of what we might deem excess, then that's a healthier place, not only for the planet, but it's actually a healthier place for all of us. And by kind of necessity, if we're all living in that space, then inequality would be much smaller than it currently is anyway, because we are all living within a concept of enough, and not striving to kind of go beyond that at the expense of those who therefore have to live below that.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple more minutes, so there's still time for a couple more questions. We've got a question here about you said earlier, Hannah, that the church should be speaking against inequality when it's a form of injustice. In the roundtables, did you find any consensus on inequality when it's not a form of injustice, when it's not because of unjust practices or structures? And what's the responsibility of people to work and contribute to the degree to which they're able? People are coming from different starting points.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the majority, so inequality as a result of injustice can be when wealth has been through blatantly criminal or kind of inherently unjust ways of achieving that wealth. I think there are probably different perspectives on whether having extreme wealth is an injustice in and of itself, or is something we want to be against in and of itself. People definitely come from different perspectives on that. And I think there is certainly consensus that there is a responsibility to contribute to the degree that you're able, not necessarily for purely economic reasons, but actually it's a healthy society in which everyone can contribute. I think there is a responsibility for the church and for us when we're talking about justice and injustice to ensure that the society is a place in which everyone is able to contribute to the degree that they're able. And there is sometimes things that get in the way of that, and we might call those matters of justice. So I think we didn't talk a huge amount about inequality when it's not from injustice, in the sense of whether that's a completely separate issue. But I think it's a really important question to consider anyway.
Because ultimately there will be, we're aiming for getting rid of all inequality is obviously not a practical or even potentially not even a desirable position anyway. So there will always be greater rewards for those who have greater responsibility in their roles at work, for example, and presumably that would be acceptable within this Christian model of the economy.
Yeah, definitely. We're very clear, I think, that the goal of this report and the goal of achieving consensus around addressing inequality as a problem isn't to eradicate it completely. I think that's actually where a lot of the polarization stems from, the idea that as soon as you talk about addressing inequality, you're caricatured as kind of being a communist and wanting everyone to have the same, wanting there to be no equality at all. That's not practical. That's not really a possibility. It's not achievable, but it's also not something we're arguing as desirable. Certainly the idea of reducing excessive inequality is a much more achievable thing. There will always, as you say, be some disparities or some inequalities in a society in which there is freedom and in which there is democracy, and that's a healthy thing. But if it's extreme, if it's excessive, then it stops being such a healthy thing. Whether it's because of injustice directly or because of kind of indirect forms of justice or injustice.
Great. I've got a question about neighborliness and the neighbor, and you talk about this in the report, and you make what I found quite a striking point, that in our globalized, increasingly connected age, we are who might be considered our neighbor is now could apply to anybody around the world, because we have connections now to everybody in terms of through the supply chains that produce the products we consume. And this seems to me to be quite a different scenario than for our ancestors, when the connections between individuals were much smaller. So if we are sort of find ourselves thrust into this position where everybody around the world is our neighbor, how can we then go about building a greater sense of global neighborliness so that we become more cognizant of that fact that my consumption choices are directly impacting upon the lives of people thousands of miles away who I will never know? How can we become more conscious of that?
So I think to say that everyone in the world is potentially our neighbour is true, but it doesn't absolve us from specific responsibilities and particular responsibilities to our neighbours closer to home. So it's not to say that everyone is your neighbour and so we should, do good to everybody, and we don't have any greater responsibility to our neighbour who is the person sleeping on the doorstep outside our house than we do to someone thousands of miles away. But I think it is equally important to be aware of those things, that in terms of our use of planetary resources and kind of with the carbon thing that we talked about before, the way that actually, our use of resources does affect people thousands of miles away, whether that is through supply chains, as you were saying, and the kind of the connection that we have through that is much more indirect and yet shorter of a connection than it sometimes was in previous generations, or whether that is being aware of the fact that those who will kind of experience the effects of climate change the hardest are often the ones who have done the least to contribute to climate change and to our use of carbon. So I think it's not about talking about global neighbours at the expense of also considering very acutely our local neighbours, and at the same time, it's not about talking about actually we're in the UK, we're very unequal. The inequality between the UK and X country 1,000 miles away is so great that actually it's daft to talk about inequality within the UK, because that is really trivial compared to that. That's not the case either, because actually the inequality within the UK is what affects our relationships, is what affects our communities much more directly than global inequality. So I think it's both and in terms of thinking about neighbourliness and thinking about different conceptions of inequality. Both are important. It matters that inequality is great within the UK because that affects the way we live, but it does also matter that we are comparatively wealthy compared to most of the world, and that's a different form of inequality that we should also be thinking about.
Great. Well, I think that is a great way to end. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us and for this lunchtime talk. And I want to thank Hannah once again for producing this Really important and timely report. We can't see our guests, but I'm sure that they are applauding you heartily from their homes. Please give feedback on today's event. My colleague Abby has put a survey in the chat box, so you can click on that and we can email that form to you as well. If you'd like to hear more about Theos, about our research and events, do subscribe to the newsletter at the link that Abby's posted. You can also download Hannah's report from the website, and you can order that hard copy for your Christmas stocking. It should just about fit in there. If you're on Facebook and Twitter, please do follow us at Theos Think Tank. We've got our world famous Christmas books recommendation video coming out shortly, so do look out for that. Finally, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye.